We often look towards, the traditional political avenues when we think about shaping the future, elections, laws, that sort of thing.
Right.
But there's this really dynamic and, frankly, powerful movement gaining steam from a different place, young people.
Okay.
They're actively working for a more just world.
Yeah, and what really jumps out, is just how many different ways they're getting involved now.
Yeah.
It's not just confined to voting or joining political parties anymore. We're seeing a real surge in activism, like on the ground, in schools, and maybe most significantly online.
Exactly. And that's what this deep dive is all about. We want to explore this global phenomenon. We're going to unpack how young people are becoming these key drivers of change, often working, well, outside those established political systems.
Right.
Our goal is really to understand what's fueling this engagement and all the different shapes it takes.
We've got a really great set of sources to help us dig into this. Articles from Coyote Magazine, the BBC. They give us these firsthand accounts, some really insightful analysis, too. Then there's research from Science Direct, which is all about scientific research, and Circle, that's the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. So evidence-based stuff.
Good, good.
Plus, we have reports looking specifically at the globalization of youth activism and human rights, and another one from the International Peace Institute about youth participation in global governance.
Okay, quite a spread. So let's start maybe with this thing our sources call the democratic paradox. It's this interesting idea, right? Young people might be, well, less involved in traditional politics like voting, but at the same time, they have really strong beliefs about democratic participation. They genuinely want to engage in meaningful ways. Why do you think that contradiction or apparent contradiction exists?
That's a really good question. The sources seem to suggest that, well, when young people don't see their concerns being tackled, or they feel like making real change through the usual political channels is just too hard, maybe impossible, it can lead them to look for these other ways, these alternative avenues for political engagement. Maybe they feel like they can actually do more to direct action.
Okay, so what do these alternative forms actually look like? What are we talking about?
Well, it's a whole range of things. Social media activism is huge, obviously.
Obvious.
Using it for awareness, organizing events, you name it. But we're also seeing, grassroots movements really taking off, protests, community organizing, even things like political consumerism, choosing what you buy based on your values.
Right, voting with your wallet.
Exactly. And using art, performance, creative expression as a form of activism, too.
It sounds much more, I don't know, adaptable. I mean, less about rigid structures, more about tackling the issues they care about head on.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The sources really hammer home that it's issue-focused, it's often informal, sometimes pretty spontaneous.
Yeah.
It seems to reflect this desire for political processes that feel more inclusive, more responsive, ultimately just more dynamic than what they see in traditional politics.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. We're seeing young people right at the heart of some major social movements.
Definitely.
Think about Occupy, Fridays for Future, #MeToo, Black Lives Matter. Youth involvement has been absolutely central to all of them.
Absolutely. And the fact that these movements often cross borders, they're transnational. That's really key.
How so?
Well, social media acts as this incredible connector, right?
Yeah.
It lets young activists in different countries share ideas, strategies, and maybe crucially, feel that sense of solidarity. Even just through these virtual interactions, the BBC article really pointed out how technology has just amplified their voices in ways we haven't really seen before.
And it's not like one single monolithic movement, is it? I mean, Coyote Magazine brings up the idea of intersectionality. That seems really important here. Could you explain why that's such a crucial lens?
Yeah, intersectionality is basically understanding that people have multiple parts to their identity, gender, race, sexual orientation, class, ability, all of it. And they can experience discrimination or disadvantage in ways that overlap and interact. So for young activists, especially those from marginalized groups, young women, LGBTI youth from racially marginalized communities, recognizing these intersecting experiences is fundamental if you want to build movements that are truly inclusive,
Yeah.
and frankly, effective.
So, like, a young activist who's, say, Black and queer might face a really unique set of hurdles,
Exactly.
challenges that maybe a white, straight male activist wouldn't even think about.
Precisely. And what's actually quite encouraging is that many recent movements seem to be getting better at adopting this intersectional view, understanding how different kinds of inequality are linked. That Coyote Magazine piece mentioned how climate justice movements are increasingly connecting environmental issues with gender inequality, LGBTQ plus rights, migration, broader ecological justice.
Oh, okay.
There's this growing recognition that these struggles are all kind of tangled up together.
Yeah.
You need a more holistic approach to really make change.
Okay, let's make this more concrete. Our sources share some really powerful stories of individual young activists. Let's start with Marta in Poland. What does her story tell us?
Marta's story, which is in Coyote Magazine, is focused on those big protests in Poland back in 2020.
Against the abortion restrictions.
Exactly, against tightening the already strict abortion laws. It was a time of massive public mobilization, and Marta was right there in the middle of it, going to demonstrations, organizing sit-ins.
And the tactics they used sounded quite creative, almost like a new kind of protest.
They were certainly inventive. I mean, beyond the huge marches, they focused on engaging the public directly, collecting signatures for a proposal to actually liberalize abortion access.
Okay.
But what really stood out were these performative protests aimed right at the Catholic Church.
Why the church specifically?
Well, it was widely seen as a major force pushing for the restrictive laws. So Marta described being part of sit-ins during Sunday Mass, directly confronting priests with their demands, even like leaving protest flyers in the collection baskets, chanting slogans inside and outside churches. It gives you a real sense of activists pushing the envelope.
Definitely pushing boundaries. Okay, then we shift to Hungary, Andras. A very different situation, but equally worrying with that 2021 law targeting LGBTQ plus content.
Yeah, Andrus's experience also from Coyote Magazine really shows how quickly the space for LGBTQ plus activism shrunk in Hungary. That law, basically banning content seen as promoting homosexuality or gender change to minors, it just created this really oppressive atmosphere. More censorship, activists under much greater scrutiny.
It sounds like the official response to any dissent was pretty harsh.
It was. Andras talked about ongoing police harassment being watched, the constant threat of legal trouble. He was actually fined, along with other students, just for peaceful protest at a museum in Budapest.
Jeez.
But even in that really difficult environment, Andras and others found these incredibly creative ways to keep resisting.
Like those flash protests and the plastic protests. Tell us a bit more about those.
Yeah, the flash protests were these super quick, spontaneous things in public squares. Activists would just pop up, display rainbow flags, hand out info, and then disappear before the police could really react.
That's smart.
And the plastic protest was really symbolic and visually striking. After the law meant lots of books with LGBTQ plus themes got wrapped in plastic foil in bookstores.
Oh, right.
Andras and others literally wrapped themselves in plastic wrap, chanting things like, "Are you going to wrap me in plastic too?" It was just a really powerful visual way to protest the censorship and what they felt was the dehumanization of LGBTQ plus people.
That's incredibly powerful. Okay, lastly, Sophia in Italy. Her story brings in that often overlooked angle of young activists who are also racially marginalized, and her struggle for citizenship adds a whole other layer.
Sophia's story in Coyote Magazine really highlights the systemic hurdles faced by young people who are second-generation immigrants.
Right.
Even though she was born and raised in Italy, her parents are Moroccan, she spent her whole life dealing with visa delays, complex residence permit renewals, just constant bureaucratic battles. And as a young woman of African descent, she's also directly experienced racism and xenophobia. She said it's gotten worse with the rise of a more right-wing political climate there.
And her activism seems to stem directly from that personal experience, right? It's not just abstract migrant rights, it's rooted in her life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She's used social media really effectively to raise awareness about the specific challenges second-gen migrants face, making and sharing videos about their often invisible struggles. She also started these pop-up aid stations.
What were those?
Basically providing essential support, food, information to migrants, but trying to do it in a way that avoided unnecessary contact with official authorities, which can sometimes be fraught.
And those school workshops she ran sound amazing too, creating dialogue at such a crucial age.
They were really valuable. Sophia and a friend organized these workshops in local schools, bringing together Italian and migrant teenagers to openly talk about their experiences with discrimination.
Wow.
and then collaboratively figure out ways to challenge it. It even led to the students creating their own little magazine, a fanzine, as another way to get their voices out there.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and her work with a volunteer legal team helping migrants was so impactful it actually inspired her to go to law school herself so she can keep fighting for migrant rights systemically.
These stories really drive home the diversity of motivations and just how resourceful young activists are being. Okay, let's zoom out a bit now and talk about Gen Z. The BBC article suggests this is a generation uniquely positioned for change.
Yeah, Gen Z born roughly 95 to 2010, they've really grown up during a time of, well, pretty significant global challenges.
You can say that again.
Climate change escalating, widening economic inequality, social unrest, political division, economic uncertainty, and then boom, a global pandemic.
Yeah.
The BBC makes a strong case that facing these defining issues has really been a major catalyst mobilizing this generation.
And technology, especially social media, has played just a massive role in how their activism looks, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. They're the first generation that's truly digitally native. They grew up constantly connected.
Yeah.
And that's amplified their voices,
Yeah.
their ability to organize in ways previous generations just couldn't. The BBC notes how they often get their news almost entirely through smartphones, social media feeds, often bypassing traditional news outlets altogether.
Yeah.
This constant feed of what one source called grim realities seems to have created this real sense of urgency, a need to proactively tackle hardship.
That statistic from the BBC piece, something like 70% of Gen Z involved in some social or political cause, that's huge. And it's not just traditional activism, right?
No, not at all. It covers a much wider spectrum. Things like actively boycotting products or consciously deciding not to work for employers whose values don't align with theirs. They are, like, by far the generation most likely to make those everyday choices based on political, social, or environmental beliefs.
It feels like there's a real disillusionment with the traditional political systems that's pushing them towards more direct action.
The research the BBC cited definitely points that way. Lower trust in democratic processes among young people compared to older generations.
Why do you think that is?
Well, things like economic precarity probably play the big role. More student debt, harder to own a home. That might contribute to losing faith in the system.
Makes sense.
But, as one expert noted, this seeming withdrawal from formal politics often goes hand in hand with a big increase in participation in more direct stuff, like protests and boycotts. They seem to be looking for ways to make change happen more immediately, more tangibly.
And they're starting younger, too, aren't they? Greta Thunberg is the obvious example, but there are others, like Lysipria Kangwajam. It feels almost like a new kind of, what did one source call it? Post-celebrity activism?
Exactly. Part of what makes figures like Thunberg so relatable, so inspiring to other kids, is that they seem ordinary in a way traditional celebrities aren't.
Right.
And we're seeing more and more young activists like Kangwajam from India getting global recognition at really young ages for their work on critical stuff, like climate change and plastic pollution.
And social media is basically their personal press tool, as one activist told the BBC.
Yeah, it gives them the power to tell their own stories directly. They can bypass the traditional media gatekeepers, connect with a global audience entirely on their own terms. This leads to what the BBC called the global nature of these movements. Online organizing just flows seamlessly into offline action. Think about the school strike for climate, started online, exploded into this massive global movement with physical protests everywhere.
It also seems to be becoming much more woven into their actual identities, maybe more than before.
Yeah, social media kind of blurs those lines between private and public life. Their activism isn't just something they do. It's increasingly part of who they are. It influences their friendships, their career paths, their whole sense of self and purpose.
Interesting.
And importantly, research suggests this commitment, these deeply held beliefs, tend to stick around over time. It challenges that old idea that everyone just automatically gets more conservative as they age.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. The Science Direct article talks about the moral power of youth climate activists. It's a really interesting phrase.
It is, isn't it? The article suggests these young activists are acting as norm entrepreneurs. Meaning they're actively trying to change how we understand and talk about climate change.
Yes.
Shifting it away from just being an economic problem, cost-benefit analysis,
Right.
and towards a framework that includes multiple dimensions of climate justice, ethical concerns, social impacts.
And have they been successful in shifting that conversation, at least in some places?
Well, the analysis they did looking at Twitter data around the big UN climate conferences, the COPs, and youth protests between 2014 and 2021, it strongly suggests that, yes, their core idea is this normative framework about moving away from fossil fuels, achieving climate justice. It has started to penetrate the public discourse.
So people are talking about it differently?
It seems so. They've gained support from people and groups outside the immediate youth climate movement, which is really crucial for changing norms more broadly.
Okay, so their moral power seems clear in shaping the conversation, but the article also mentioned we need more research on how that translates into actual policy changes in those big international negotiations.
That's a really crucial caveat.
Yes, yeah.
While they're clearly influencing how we think and talk about climate change,
Yeah.
the extent to which that moral authority directly changes the decisions made by governments, by powerful actors in those international forums, that's still something we need to study more closely. The link isn't always direct or clear. Got it.
Okay, moving to the Circle report now. This one focuses more on the community-level impact of youth activism. It highlights assets young people bring that maybe we overlook. And Circle, just to remind everyone, researches youth civic engagement specifically.
Right. And Circle's research really emphasizes that young people have always been, and still are, right at the forefront of activism, community organizing, social movements. They bring this unique mix of energy, fresh perspectives, and just a deep commitment to the issues they care most about.
And getting involved like that has real benefits for the young people themselves, too, doesn't it? Especially maybe for those from marginalized backgrounds.
Oh, absolutely. Participating in activism and community organizing helps with personal growth. It builds valuable social networks, often connects them with mentors.
Right.
And it's crucial for developing leadership skills. And importantly, for young people who face systemic barriers, this kind of engagement can actually be a pathway to addressing inequality and even improving their own economic situation down the line.
Interesting connection there.
Yeah, and the report also stresses how important civic learning education is, basically, teaching young people how to be effective agents of change in their communities.
Okay, our final source takes us to the really big picture. The report on the globalization of youth activism and human rights. It frames youth activism as this direct response to global injustices.
Yeah, this report really hammers home how globalization has massively increased awareness of human rights abuses, environmental damage, all sorts of social, political, economic injustices happening worldwide.
So we just know more about what's going on everywhere.
Pretty much. And this global awareness has also shifted the focus of activism. It used to be maybe more single-issue focused, but now there's a better understanding of how these big global processes are all interconnected.
And we've seen this kind of activism actually lead to change, right?
Yes. The report points to things like the rejection of the multilateral agreement on investment. That was a big win, where international activist coalitions really raised the alarm about its potential negative impacts. And activism has been key in pushing for progress on tons of global issues. Debt relief for poorer nations, gender equality, tackling the AIDS crisis, fighting child labor, addressing global warming. That picture from the 2000 WTO protest in Prague about debt-hurting education really captures that spirit.
It's interesting that a lot of youth activism seems specifically focused on demanding the right to participate in decision-making itself.
That's a really key point. Young people are increasingly saying, we need a seat at the table.
Yeah.
They're actively pushing for youth councils, forums, ways to get their voices heard, and perspectives considered at every level of government. The report kind of contrasts this more, let's say, institutional approach with the big, visible street demonstrations that grab headlines.
The report also gets into the tricky relationship between globalization and human rights, doesn't it? It's not all positive.
Not at all. It's complex. On one hand, yes, globalization makes information about human rights much easier to get. It helps monitor abuses, gives people facing threats a way to reach an international audience. Even the International Criminal Court is seen as a potential positive outcome of this interconnectedness.
But
there are downsides. Potential clashes between international economic rules and human rights protections. The widening gap between rich and poor countries means unequal access to information. Concerns about applying human rights concepts universally without enough cultural sensitivity. even the risk of unwanted interventions in other countries' affairs.
Okay.
Plus, globalization can sometimes weaken people's ability to participate in decisions that affect them or put pressure on nations through things like privatization or debt
Yeah.
that makes it harder for them to meet basic needs for their citizens.
And globalization has changed activism itself, too.
Hugely. The internet, obviously, just turbocharged communication and organizing across borders.
Yeah.
We see activism often moving outside formal political channels, partly because there's a perception that corporations have too much influence on governments.
Right.
Shared worries about globalization are linking different campaigns together. Youth lobbying is getting more sophisticated. Technology means a bigger audience, more participation, better collaboration, bigger networks. It helps activists feel less isolated.
But activists still face big challenges in this globalized world.
Definitely. Mainstream media, often owned by big corporations, well, there can be conflicts of interest. Sometimes youth activism gets misrepresented or human rights abuses don't get covered properly. Young people can also feel politically marginalized, like the global marketplace and weakening national governments aren't addressing their concerns.
So the report connects activism directly to specific human rights.
Yes, fundamental rights like freedom of opinion and expression, peaceful assembly, participating in government.
Yeah.
It also points out that if young people's own human rights are being violated, their ability to engage in activism is obviously reduced. And it uses case studies like Amnesty's campaign for Aminu Lawal in Nigeria, or the global debt relief movement, which really grew out of those anti-globalization protests to show the real impact activism can have.
Okay, finally, let's look at the International Peace Institute report on youth participation in global governance. It says youth are doing more in climate action and peace building, but they're still kind of sidelined in the big global policy forums.
Yeah, the IPI report identifies 4 main reasons for this. First, misperceptions about youth.
Yeah.
Often based on age and gender stereotypes.
Like what?
Like viewing young men mainly as potential threats, young women mainly as passive victims. This leads to security-focused responses that completely miss the peace-building work young people are actually doing.
Ah, okay.
Second, global policy frameworks on youth are often outdated, fragmented. There isn't a strong, unified approach linking peace, security, climate action, sustainable development.
Right.
Third, chronic underfunding. Youth groups and activists constantly struggle for resources, rely on volunteers, face really burdensome application processes for tiny bits of funding.
Always the funding issue.
Always. And fourth, weak institutional links. Youth often only get advisory roles in global governance bodies, no real decision-making power. And it's hard for them to engage with these big, hierarchical institutions.
It's interesting how the report contrasts the youth, peace, and security, the YPS agenda, with the youth climate movement. They develop differently.
And yeah, the YPS agenda grew more closely with the UN Security Council, so it has a stronger formal framework. Youth climate action often started more as a counter-movement, working outside those structures.
So Youngo, the youth constituency at the climate talks, doesn't have as much clout.
Its influence seems limited, yeah. And disagreements on big things like political participation or sexual and reproductive rights have made it hard to create one big overarching framework for youth and sustainable development.
But even with the stronger YPS framework, there's still a disconnect between local work and high-level policy.
Exactly. That's a key point. The report talks about how negative or simplistic views of youth persist either too optimistic or too pessimistic, often not based on evidence. Participation is often just symbolic.
Right, tokenism.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Those gendered stereotypes in conflict zones are a big problem. Adolescent girls and young women face double discrimination, age and gender. Plus, there's growing worry about threats to young peace builders and climate activists, stigma, hate speech, online harassment, even being targeted by government.
It's serious.
Very. And the existing policies, like the World Program of Action for Youth from '95, or the non-binding Youth 2030 strategy, just aren't seen as strong enough. Add the underfunding, the weak institutional links. It all limits their influence.
Are there any positive examples?
The report does mention the Council of Europe's co-management system as a good regional example, where youth actually share decision-making power on issues affecting them. So it could be done.
Okay, so pulling all this together, it really feels like young people are this incredibly powerful force for change. They're using such a diverse toolkit, so many creative methods, to tackle huge global challenges.
That's definitely a key takeaway.
Yeah.
Despite facing really significant hurdles, getting excluded from formal power structures, they are absolutely actively shaping the world.
And the real aha moment for me, I think, is that while we often hear about young people being disengaged from politics,
Right.
the reality is completely different. They are anything but passive. They seem driven by this deep desire for a world that's more just, more equitable, more sustainable, and they're finding their own ways to make that happen.
Which really leads to a final thought, maybe a question for you, our listener. Given all this energy, this innovation, this moral clarity we see from young activists, what fundamental changes do we need in our political systems, our social structures, to really empower their participation, to actually harness their potential to solve these massive challenges we all face? And maybe think about what role could you play in supporting these young people who are trying to change the world?